The air inside the MSNBC studio was crisp, rehearsed, and predictably left-leaning. Rachel Maddow sat behind her glass desk, papers neatly aligned, voice calm but pointed, as always. Tonight's guest, however, wasn't part of the usual echo chamber. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, stood backstage under cold lighting, her green blazer sharp against the black curtain. A small silver cross hung at her collarbone, a symbol she wore not just for faith, but for defiance. A producer whispered, 3 seconds, and Karoline exhaled. She wasn't nervous. She was ready. Rachel introduced her with a familiar smirk. "Joining us tonight," she said to the camera, "is Karoline Leavitt, Trump's press secretary, Gen Z firebrand, and recent defender of what some might call alternative facts." The jab was light, but deliberate. Karoline stepped into the light. The studio audience, mostly quiet, watched with a mix of curiosity and expectation, as if waiting for her to trip. She didn't. Instead, she sat with perfect posture, hands folded, eyes locked onto Rachel. "Karoline," Rachel began, "many in the media, and frankly in both parties, say your job isn't to tell the truth, but to shield it. What do you say to those who believe you're too young, too inexperienced, or frankly, too ignorant to speak for a president?" The word hit like a punch. Ignorant. The crowd shifted. Karoline didn't flinch. Her voice was even, clear. "I say they've mistaken age for weakness and media bias for truth." Rachel smiled tightly. "You don't believe you've ever misled the public?" Karoline leaned in. "I believe your network spent 4 years calling Hunter Biden's laptop Russian disinformation. Was that leadership or selective amnesia?" Gasps. Rachel blinked, only for a second, but Karoline had already pressed forward. "Let's be clear," Karoline said, her tone firmer now. "I don't need a Harvard degree to know how Americans feel at the pump, at the border, or when they pray in public and get mocked for it." Rachel's face twitched. The script wasn't going the way it usually did. "Ignorant?" Karoline repeated. "You've been in media for decades and still can't tell the difference between dissent and disinformation. Maybe it's not ignorance you're seeing. Maybe it's conviction." Silence. Then Rachel chuckled, adjusting her glasses. "Well, we're in for quite a conversation," she said, voice flatter than usual. Karoline smiled faintly. "You wanted fire? I brought facts." The segment cut to commercial. But the war had just begun. When the commercial break ended, the studio lights flared back on, brighter, almost accusatory. Rachel Maddow adjusted her notes like a professor preparing to reclaim control of a lecture. But this wasn't a classroom, and Karoline Leavitt wasn't a student. She was here for a fight, and she wasn't planning on blinking. Rachel leaned forward, adopting a tone of composed civility. "Karoline," she began, "you're a spokesperson for a man who's been impeached twice, indicted multiple times, and has repeatedly, let's be honest, blurred the line between truth and fiction. Do you genuinely believe you're defending democracy?" Karoline didn't even hesitate. "I'm defending the millions of Americans who feel like their voices have been drowned out by elites who speak at them. Not for them," she replied calmly. Rachel's eyebrow twitched. "So, questioning elections, defunding climate programs, mocking science, all of that is democracy now?" Karoline folded her hands neatly. "No, Rachel. But neither is silencing parents at school board meetings, labeling people as extremists for going to church, or using the FBI to censor social media." The room shifted. Even behind the cameras, the energy snapped from smug to uncertain. Rachel smirked, but her voice wavered slightly. "That sounds like a page out of a conspiracy playbook," she said. Karoline didn't smile. She leaned in. "Conspiracy? Or correction? Because your network told America the border was secure while millions flooded through. You told them inflation was temporary while groceries hit record highs. That's not journalism, Rachel. That's narrative management." A sharp inhale could be heard from someone in the crew. Rachel tried to pivot. "Do you ever wonder if you're being used? A polished spokesperson for someone else's playbook?" Caroline's response came like ice. I wonder if you realize you've been reading from the same script since 2008. The difference is, mine wasn't written in a green room. The blow landed. Rachel blinked rapidly, her practiced rhythm broken. Karoline pressed on. You said I was ignorant. But let's be honest. What you really meant is that I'm not one of you. I don't have your credentials, your media club pass, or your worldview. And that's exactly why I'm here. Because Americans are tired of being told what to think by people who've never walked in their shoes. The audience, normally silent during these segments, broke into a small, spontaneous clap. Rachel glanced toward the control booth. Off script, off balance, off brand. And Karoline knew it. She adjusted the small silver cross on her collar and delivered the line that would trend before the hour was over. Ignorance isn't what you lack in degrees. It's what you ignore when the truth doesn't fit your politics. Rachel sat back. For once, no clever segue came to her lips. And for the first time on her show, Rachel Maddow was no longer in control of the narrative. Rachel Maddow cleared her throat, forcing a half smile as the camera rolled silently on her. She was used to leading interviews, not weathering storms in them. She glanced at her notes, searching for control, for footing. But Karoline had already shifted the terrain. Rachel spoke, measured. You're young, confident, and I'll admit, well-spoken. But do you ever worry that your conviction blinds you to nuance? That your message, no matter how polished, lacks compassion? Karoline's eyes narrowed slightly. That word, compassion, wasn't thrown casually. It was strategic, a soft jab dressed as virtue, but Karoline didn't blink. I worry, she said slowly, about Americans who can't afford eggs while political elites sip champagne on panels about equity. She leaned in, voice steady but now heavier, touched with real feeling. I worry about single moms working 2 jobs who pray no one calls them extremist just for going to church. I worry about farmers taxed to the bone by people who've never set foot on a field. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, sensing the room's air change again. Karoline continued. I'm 27, Rachel. I didn't go to Ivy League cocktail parties. I went to public school, lived in small towns, watched my parents work every hour God gave them. I wasn't handed talking points. I earned my voice. She paused, letting that sink in. And yet, you called me ignorant. Rachel's posture stiffened. Karoline, you know that wasn't personal. Wasn't it? Karoline interrupted gently but firmly. Because when someone like me speaks, and it doesn't match your narrative, you call it ignorance. But when a coastal host recycles political fiction with a PhD tone, it's called journalism. The audience went completely still, not hostile, just quiet, watching, absorbing. Karoline's voice softened. You want compassion, Rachel? I have it. For the trucker who lost work because of a vaccine mandate. For the soldier mocked for praying before deployment. For the grandmother silenced online for quoting scripture. She looked into the camera now, not at Rachel. To every American who's been called backwards, bigoted, or broken because they still believe in faith, family, and freedom, I see you, I work for you, I fight for you. Applause burst from a corner of the room. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real, and Rachel knew it. She sat straighter, lips pursed, tone clipped now. Well, I suppose it depends on what version of America you believe in. Karoline didn't hesitate. I believe in one where people can disagree without being demonized, where truth isn't edited to fit airtime, and where being young doesn't mean being dismissed. She let that hang. Rachel didn't reply. Not yet. Karoline had done what few could do in Rachel Maddow's domain. She had made the audience question who the real voice of the people was. And as the commercial break approached, even the producers weren't sure which one of them they should be zooming in on anymore. The next segment returned from break, and Rachel Maddow had clearly shifted gears. Gone was the light jab and smile approach. Now her tone had hardened. Not angry, but surgical. like a professor determined to reclaim her classroom from a rogue student who had dared to speak without permission. "Karoline," she said, voice sharpened, "you speak passionately, I'll grant you that. But let's talk facts." She lifted a paper from her desk, holding it slightly for the camera. "Your administration repeatedly downplayed the climate crisis, refused to back pandemic measures, and promoted what many call disinformation. Are we supposed to believe you're fighting for truth while denying science?" Karoline sat quietly, letting Rachel finish. Then, with a calmness that seemed almost designed to provoke further irritation, she reached into her document folder. "Let's talk about that word. Disinformation," she said, pulling out a printed page. She slid it across the desk toward Rachel. "This is a transcript from your show, March 2020. You said, quote, 'Masks may actually cause more panic than protection.' That's you, Rachel. Not me." Rachel blinked. She knew the clip. She hadn't expected it to be brought up. Karoline kept going. "October 2021, your show again? You mocked parents protesting CRT, calling them misinformed suburban mobs? Today, even moderate liberals admit the implementation was rushed and miscommunicated." She pulled another page. "And let's not forget the infamous Russia collusion story. You called it the smoking gun. Millions watched you insist there was proof. But the final report said otherwise." Rachel's jaw tightened. "Are you saying I lied?" "I'm saying you editorialized, constantly, and presented it as fact. And now when someone calls that out, you hide behind your resume." The studio lights suddenly felt hotter. Rachel tried to pivot. "The difference is I rely on institutions. You rely on outrage." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Institutions like Twitter censorship teams, DOJ memos about labeling parents domestic threats? That's not journalism, that's gatekeeping." Rachel's lips parted, but Karoline cut in. "And let's talk about compassion again. When churches were closed and bars stayed open, your show called that reasonable, was it?" No answer. "When biological men entered women's sports, you said inclusion matters. But what about fairness?" Still silence. Karoline leaned back slightly, her tone now less confrontational, more disappointed. "You once stood for hard questions, for nuance. Now it's all labels. If someone disagrees, they're ignorant, dangerous, misinformed. I'm none of those, Rachel. I just refuse to speak your language." Rachel stared at the papers on her desk, not because she hadn't seen them before, but because this time they weren't in her hands. They were in her guests. And for the first time in years, Rachel Maddow looked like someone being fact-checked, live, without a buffer. The camera zoomed slightly on Karoline, confident, calm, still holding the truth, on paper. And in that moment, no clever phrasing could flip the balance back. Rachel Maddow sat frozen for a moment, her eyes locked on the printed pages Karoline had laid before her. She wasn't used to being the one receiving the pushback, especially not with her own words thrown back at her under studio lights. But she wasn't about to fold. Her voice returned, lower now, tighter. "You seem very proud of your composure," she said, folding her hands. "But let's talk about what that confidence is built on. You serve a man whose rhetoric has divided this nation, who lied, insulted, and manipulated millions. And yet you present yourself as a moral authority." Karoline blinked once, then straightened. "I don't present myself as anything," she replied evenly. "I show up. I speak what I believe. The public decides what that means." Rachel didn't yield. "You represent power wrapped in charm, a dangerous mix," she added, with emphasis. "You might smile through it, but what you defend, what you enable, tears people apart." There it was, not a debate, a moral indictment. The studio was dead quiet. Karoline looked across the table. Her voice when she spoke was still. "Dangerous?" she repeated. Rachel nodded subtly, sensing momentum. But Karoline didn't flinch. She reached up and gently adjusted the small silver cross on her collar. "My parents raised me to believe that speaking your mind, especially when it's unpopular, is not dangerous. It's American. She paused. You call me dangerous because I don't parrot your priorities, because I value faith, sovereignty, family, and responsibility. If that's dangerous now, maybe the country has changed more than you want to admit. Rachel narrowed her eyes. You cloak yourself in religion to defend policies that hurt people. Karoline's voice remained calm, but her gaze sharpened. Number I wear this cross, she said, tapping the necklace, because I believe truth has value, even when it offends. She leaned forward. You talk about harm, Rachel? Real harm is families unable to afford rent because of inflation your party said wouldn't happen. Real harm is women losing scholarships because no one will define the word female anymore. Real harm is labeling every disagreement as hate until no one's allowed to speak at all. The audience stirred. Something in the air had shifted again. Rachel shifted in her seat. You make big claims, Karoline, but you're not the one who'll face the consequences if someone takes your words and uses them to justify cruelty. Karoline's expression hardened, but her voice didn't rise. I face consequences every day, Rachel. I get hate mail for quoting scripture, death threats for saying America should secure its borders. And I keep showing up, because I believe saying nothing is worse than saying what's hard to hear. Rachel sat back, absorbing that. Karoline pressed on. You want to paint me as the villain because I speak calmly and carry conviction. But maybe the real threat to your world isn't ignorance. Maybe it's clarity. The control booth said nothing. The cameramen didn't move. Everyone was watching something rare. A young woman under fire turning a moral accusation into a moment of moral defiance, without yelling, without spinning, without blinking. And Rachel? For a flicker of a second, even she looked unsure of where to go next. Rachel Maddow inhaled slowly, trying to recalibrate. Karoline had survived. No, outmaneuvered. A moral accusation. And the audience wasn't shifting back. Time for a new tactic. She glanced toward the camera with a brief nod. When she spoke again, her voice carried a broader tone, one that reached past Karoline, straight into living rooms across America. You speak with certainty, Karoline, Rachel began, but have you stopped to consider how your words ripple out into the public? You say you get hate mail, but you also inspire it. Some of the most aggressive and hateful rhetoric online today quotes your speeches. Don't you think that matters? Karoline tilted her head slightly. She could see the pivot, from individual clash to collective guilt. I think it's interesting, she said quietly, how quickly passion becomes hate when it doesn't support your worldview. Rachel held her ground. This isn't about worldviews. It's about accountability. Karoline smiled faintly. You mean like when CNN called parents terrorists for speaking at school boards? Or when Twitter censored doctors who questioned lockdown policies, only to be proven right later? Was that accountability too? Rachel stayed focused. Online platforms are powerful, yes, but when people use your exact words to attack immigrants, women, or LGBTQ youth, don't you think you have a duty to clarify what you really mean? Karoline straightened. I think the duty is to stop pretending that disagreement is violence. She leaned in. When I say I believe in two genders, I'm not erasing anyone. I'm defending fairness in sport, in safety, in science. When I say we need border control, I'm not inciting hate. I'm recognizing that a sovereign nation must know who enters and why. Rachel opened her mouth, but Karoline raised a hand, calm but firm. And I will not be held responsible for the rage of people who twist my words, any more than you've taken responsibility for the millions who believed the lies your network fed them for years. The audience stirred again. Rachel stiffened. Karoline continued, voice quieter now but heavier. I grew up in a working-class family. I know what it feels like to speak and not be heard. Now I'm heard, and you want to shame me for it. Rachel tried one more jab. Being heard doesn't make you right. No, Karoline replied, but it doesn't make me dangerous either. She glanced into the camera, and again it felt like she was speaking directly to someone watching from a quiet living room, feeling misunderstood. America is a place where we used to value open debate. We used to believe that words should be tested, not canceled. That disagreement wasn't destruction. If that makes me a threat, then maybe you're not defending freedom, you're managing opinion. A quiet gasp slipped from somewhere in the crew. Rachel glanced off camera. The control booth was silent. Producers weren't interrupting. Phones buzzed. Live reactions were pouring in already. And for the first time in her career, Rachel Maddow seemed unsure whether the person sitting across from her was the one losing ground or gaining it by the second. The silence in the MSNBC studio was no longer just awkward. It was telling. Rachel Maddow adjusted her pen, a signal she was buying time. Karoline hadn't just defended herself. She had reframed the entire conversation, from ignorance to influence, from youth to voice. But Rachel wasn't done yet. "I suppose we've reached the part where facts are feelings," Rachel said, her tone clipped but steady. "Where belief outweighs expertise, and rhetoric replaces data." Karoline gave a small nod. "And we've clearly reached the part where credentials are used to silence people who don't share your worldview." The audience stirred. Rachel sat up straighter. "You're painting this as some elite versus everyman narrative, Karoline, but we're talking about policies, about real consequences, about who gets hurt." Karoline leaned forward. "So, let's talk about who gets hurt." Her voice was quieter now, but no less cutting. The mom who was fined for opening her hair salon during lockdown, while Hollywood elites threw private parties. The teacher fired for refusing to use ideologically redefined pronouns, while actual student performance plummeted. The family who lost their son to fentanyl, after the border you called secure, failed them. Rachel tried to interject, but Karoline's words kept coming. Slow, controlled, like a verdict. "These aren't hypotheticals. These are people I've met, letters I've read, funerals I've attended. So no, I don't need a media degree to speak for them." Rachel's hands curled slightly on the desk. "You keep using emotion to shut down analysis." Karoline raised her eyebrow. "And you keep using analysis to avoid accountability." The room tilted. It was subtle, but the power had shifted. Rachel may have still been behind the desk, but Karoline was clearly in control of the conversation. A producer in the back tried signaling Rachel. Time was running out. Segments were bleeding over. But Rachel waved it off. She wasn't ready to concede. "I've studied politics for 20 years, Karoline. You've lived it for 2. "And I've lived it where it hurts," Karoline shot back. "Not from a studio, from press rooms under fire, border towns overrun, churches threatened, parents silenced. I don't just talk about policy, I deal with its consequences." Rachel tried one final strike. "Isn't it exhausting? Playing the victim while defending an administration that's—" Karoline stopped her. "I'm not playing anything. I'm standing." She looked out toward the audience. "I stand for those who feel erased. I stand because someone has to say it. Truth doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the one brave enough to speak it, even here." The audience, usually trained to remain quiet, broke protocol, clapping. Some even stood. Rachel sat back, stunned. Karoline hadn't just answered questions. She had flipped the script, rewritten the tone, and reclaimed the room. And for the first time in Rachel's long career, her name wasn't the one defining the segment. It was the guest's. Rachel Maddow sat motionless, her fingers gently pressing against the rim of her coffee mug. The applause had died down, but its echo lingered. Not loud, but loud enough to stain the silence. She tried to regain posture. "Well," she began, forcing a neutral tone, "this certainly isn't the usual tone of conversation here on MSNBC." Karoline gave a polite nod, but didn't retreat. "Maybe that's the problem," she said. "Maybe we've gotten too comfortable only hearing one tone, one voice, one narrative." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "So you're accusing us of censorship now?" Karoline didn't blink. "No, I'm accusing you of sameness, of pretending that every voice outside this room is a threat instead of a perspective." Rachel leaned forward, her voice quiet but tight. "You seem to think you're here to speak for America." Karoline met her gaze. Number I'm here because most Americans haven't been invited in. They've been talked over, talked down to, and tonight I'm not speaking for them. I'm echoing them. She turned to the camera. The red light above the lens glowed, a live feed still streaming to millions. I know you're watching, she said softly, and I know some of you don't agree with me. That's okay. That's America. But disagreement doesn't mean dismissal. The control room went silent. No one dared cut her off. Karoline continued. You may not have a microphone, or a show, or a platform, but you still have your voice, and it matters, whether Rachel believes it or not. Rachel opened her mouth, but Karoline held up a hand, respectfully. You called me ignorant, and maybe, to some, I am. Maybe I haven't read every policy memo or walked the halls of elite institutions, but I've walked into veterans' homes, into church basements, into towns where factories have shut down and pride is the only thing still standing. Her voice gained strength, not volume, but weight. And in every one of those places, I met people who don't need a lecture. They need someone to remind them they're not alone. She turned slightly back to Rachel. You asked what qualifies me. The answer is simple. I listen. And when I speak, I don't do it to impress. I do it to serve. Rachel didn't respond, not because she didn't have words, but because she knew, at least tonight, they wouldn't land. The camera panned wider, catching Karoline's calm stance, her cross gleaming faintly under the lights. The segment was supposed to challenge her. Instead, it had revealed something MSNBC never expected. Not just a press secretary, a movement, a generation, a challenge to the gatekeepers. And for millions watching from small towns, military bases, truck stops, kitchen tables, Karoline's voice had cut through louder than any monologue. As the segment ended and the screen faded to commercial, the MSNBC control room lit up like a command center under siege. Phones buzzed, monitors refreshed non-stop. Social media feeds exploded. Karoline speaks. Maddow meltdown. Voice of the people. The trending list rearranged itself by the minute. Rachel Maddow sat quietly, staring at her notes but reading none of them. Her posture was straight, but her hands had stopped moving. For the first time in years, the broadcast hadn't ended with applause for her final word. It had ended with Karoline's calm stare. In a nearby conference room, MSNBC producers huddled, reviewing the live analytics. Engagement spike, one whispered. Massive. In red states especially. But even blue ones. People aren't shutting this off. Meanwhile, Karoline sat in the green room, scrolling her phone as her team buzzed around her. A short clip from the interview. The moment she said, maybe I haven't read every policy memo, but I've walked into church basements, had already hit 1 million views. Rachel, still in her studio chair, was met by a shaken staffer. Do we respond? He asked. She didn't answer. She was reading the comments now. Karoline just wiped the floor with Maddow. I don't agree with her, but damn, that's conviction. That was the most honest moment I've seen on cable in years. She made Rachel look like the establishment, because she is. The MSNBC host, known for demolishing senators, spinning narratives with poetic cadence, and out-talking anyone in her way, had been outmaneuvered. Worse, out-authenticed. Back in Karoline's room, her aide held up the phone. Trump just reposted the clip. The caption was simple. This is what real leadership looks like. Karoline. Wow. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't need to, because this wasn't about her ego. It was about impact. And she could feel it, like a pulse under the surface. Millions of Americans watching a silver cross gleam on national television and realizing that maybe, just maybe, their voice had finally made it past the glass ceiling of media. By the time the 11 p.m. news cycle began, every outlet, friend and foe, was forced to mention her. Some called her a threat, others called her a star, but none could ignore her. Even Rachel's longtime viewers were conflicted. She caught Rachel flat-footed, one journalist admitted. That hasn't happened since ever. And somewhere, in a quiet home in Ohio, A 60-year-old mother of three whispered to her husband as the TV glowed, "I don't know that girl, but I believe her." When the final credits rolled and the studio lights began to dim, Rachel Maddow remained in her seat, eyes fixed on the black screen across from her. She wasn't scribbling closing notes. She wasn't smiling for the crew. She was still. Karoline Leavitt stood just beyond the set, quietly removing her microphone. The green blazer, the silver cross, both unchanged, untouched. A producer approached her to offer a thank you, but hesitated. It wasn't just that she had dominated the interview. It was the way she had done it. Calm, focused, fierce, without venom. Back inside the studio, Rachel finally rose. A nearby assistant offered her water. She waved it off, eyes still lost in thought. For someone who had once dissected senators, foreign leaders, and legal scholars with surgical clarity, tonight had been different. Karoline stepped toward the exit. But before she left, she paused, just for a moment, at the edge of the stage. She turned. Rachel was still there, half in the shadows. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply said, "Thank you for having me." Rachel looked up, her voice softer than anyone had heard in years. "You're not what I expected." Karoline gave a small nod. "Neither are you." Then she left, not in triumph, but in truth. Outside the studio, her team gathered as the night air hit her skin. Reporters waited. Cameras flashed. One shouted, "Do you think you won tonight?" Karoline paused, looked past the lights, and answered plainly, "I didn't come to win. I came to speak." Then she stepped into the car, and the door closed. Back in the studio, Rachel finally reached for her water. She sipped once, turned toward the darkened camera, and whispered to no one in particular. She didn't just argue, she changed the terms. By sunrise, the clip of Karoline's "Disagreement isn't destruction" line had surpassed 10 million views. Op-eds exploded. CNN questioned MSNBC's handling. Fox hailed her as the voice of a rising generation. Even The Atlantic ran the headline, "Karoline Leavitt isn't just a spokesperson, she's a signal." Rachel issued no follow-up comment. She didn't need to, because the story had moved on, and so had the spotlight. In living rooms across America, people weren't quoting Maddow anymore. They were quoting Leavitt. What you just witnessed wasn't just a debate, it was a shift. One voice, dismissed as too young and too ignorant, stood tall against decades of polished narratives and media dominance. Karoline Leavitt didn't shout. She didn't dodge. She simply spoke. With clarity, with courage, and with conviction. And in doing so, she didn't just challenge Rachel Maddow. She challenged the very idea that truth belongs only to those with the biggest stage. In today's America, truth is too often managed, not spoken. But every once in a while, someone breaks through. Not with noise, but with meaning. And tonight, Karoline did exactly that. Because sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the one with the most experience. It's the one who dares to speak when silence is safer. If this moment resonated with you, if you're tired of being talked down to, if you believe that your voice matters, no matter where you're from, then remember this night, because it wasn't about politics. It was about power, and who finally claimed it back. This is Surprising Stories, and we'll see you in the next one.